Good afternoon, everybody. I'm back for the double feature of Days of Rage. We will be covering Chapter 9 this time, the actual Chapter 9. This is the rise of the BLA from June 1971 to February 1972. And it starts with a poem that was in Eldridge Cleaver's Right On Black Community News Service in the fall of 1971. And I will read it to you. Faceless brothers of the night who swim through the city like fish in the sea, never resting in your search and destroy mission against the system. I know how lonely you are. My heart reaches out to you. As repression grows, it becomes more difficult for us to continue our struggle here, but we persist until the final day when we shall join you in the sea of blood that will flow in the streets of Babylon. Well then. Well, he is, as they say, if you're 5 minutes early, you're on time. And I was 5 minutes early today, so for this stream. So anyway, there were three versions of the story of the Black Liberation Army playing out in New York as that hot summer of 1971 wore on. What the public knew, what the police suspected, and what was actually happening. To the public, the attacks in May had swiftly become old news after the arrests of Dhoruba, Moore, and his three comrades. The NYPD, it was assumed, would make more arrests as they usually did. As for the BLA itself, few believed it was anything more than a name typed on a letter. The police, however, were starting to suspect that something was afoot. All through June and July, detectives chased reports of one-time Panthers robbing drug dealers and social clubs across Queens, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. Something was clearly going on. What was happening, it is now clear, was that after the chaos at Spring, the BLA was beginning to consolidate. By July, the Panthers who had gone underground, perhaps 50 or 60 in total, had coalesced into two main cells, one based in the Bronx, one in Brooklyn, each divided into sub-cells, and each, as Eldridge Cleaver had ordained, operating independently. All were beginning to realize that it was far easier to talk about guerrilla warfare than to engage in it. We had no idea what we were up against, remembers Blood McCreary, who was busy robbing drug dealers in Brooklyn. We had really hoped that established revolutionary organizations, that they could point to us and say that unless certain things are dealt with in society, this is what you're going to be dealing with. But we were so young, we didn't know what we were doing. The cops, the government, man, they were killing us. Everywhere we looked, there were cops. I mean, this is one reason why the Weather Underground, after the original Days of Rage in Chicago and the Flint War Council, they all moved to the West Coast because they had less police pressure there than in Chicago. Excuse me, sir. The BLA's most pressing problem, however, was a lack of above-ground support, something Cleaver and Sekou Odinga in far-off Algiers constantly harped on. Other than Right On, whose next issue wouldn't appear until August, there was none. Barely a dozen people now manned the Panthers' 7th Avenue storefront as their every move was tracked by the NYPD and the FBI. Both searched for links to the underground, but other than the intermittent calls to Algeria, all monitored by the FBI, there were none to be found. The calls, in fact, only revealed the tensions among those few volunteers still supporting Cleaver. At one point, Lumumba Shakur and the Right On editor, Denise Oliver, got into a bitter argument. "I hit her in the titty," Shakur crowded to Odinga in Algiers. Cleaver was forced to intervene. With no donations, the BLA cadres turned to armed robbery. Their targets, as Dhoruba Moore's experience demonstrated, were black social clubs and drug dealers. Almost all of these robberies are lost to history. There were actions all over the 5 bureaus, recalls Blood McCreary. There were people in the drug business who were setting up others for us to move on. We raised a lot of money that way, and we were letting them know that drugs would not be tolerated anymore. One of the few surviving accounts of these robberies involves a murderous 20-year-old BLA recruit whose zeal for gunplay and wide-ranging travels would make him perhaps the single deadliest revolutionary of the decade. His name was Twyman Ford Myers. A one-time gang member with a long juvenile record of muggings and robberies, Myers had spent much of his time in the Panthers selling newspapers. His real talent, though, was violence. He used a gun more freely than almost anyone else in the BLA. Twyman is the baby of 3 or 4 kids, and they were all thugs, recalls McCreary. Twyman was political, but he was really a gangster. He had done a lot of time in jail, and there was only one thing in his mind. He always told me, I will die before I go back in jail. On the night of August 4th, 1971, Myers and a trio of BLA members burst into Thelma's Lounge on the corner of 7th Avenue and 148th Street in Harlem. After robbing the 30 patrons of $6,000, they commandeered a gypsy cab to make their escape. When the cab sagged in heavy traffic 3 blocks south, police cars arrived. Myers leaped from the cab, whipped out a .30 caliber automatic rifle, and began firing wildly up and down the street. Police hunched behind their cruisers and fired back. During the exchange, the cab driver was hit and killed. Myers threw down his gun and ran. The others surrendered and were charged with murder. For the moment, the authorities had no sense that the shooting might be tied to the fledgling BLA. Of all the deaths Twyman was involved in, the one with that cab driver bothered him the most, recalls McCreary. Shot right in the head. Twyman always said that really fucked with him. He always said, that motherfucker had nothing to do with anything. I remember when he got back to the safe house that night, that cab had just exploded. The women, they picked car glass out of his hair for 2 or 3 hours. I mean, this guy's probably got a weave, so yeah, that makes sense. The larger of the 2 BLA cells, which included the remnants of the Panthers living at 757 Beck Street, was commanded by a burly 38-year-old Army veteran named John Thomas. Another one-time resident of South Jamaica, Thomas was a heavy drinker who surrounded himself with a dozen of the most violent new BLA members, including Twyman Myers. Realizing that drug ripoffs alone wouldn't raise enough money to feed and shelter his people, he resolved to begin robbing banks. They hit the first one, in Queens, on July 29th. But it was a slapdash job. A more rigorous second robbery at a banker's trust branch on August 23rd involved half a dozen BLA members. As 4 of them trained their guns on the customers, 2 others leaped over the teller cages, rifled several drawers, and ran with the others to a waiting getaway car with about $7,700. None of the robbers wore masks. Security cameras easily recorded their every move. Within days, both the FBI and the NYPD were searching for them. 3 weeks later, this is a footnote, by the way. 3 weeks later, Thomas, Mark Holder, Frank Fields, and Joanne Chesimard were indicted for the robbery. According to a BLA member captured and interviewed by the NYPD in 1973, the participants were Thomas, his girlfriend Igne Gittins, Holder, Fields, Chesimard, and Andrew Jackson. Jackson was later tried and acquitted of involvement. 40 years later, New York detectives who have extensively researched the BLA say they doubt Chesimard was present. They believe the second woman was another female BLA member. It was then that Thomas decided New York was getting too hot for his people. Doruba's arrest also worried him, as did the arrest of several BLA soldiers attempting to set up new operations in Detroit. Thomas announced that they were leaving the city. If they were to form a legitimate guerrilla army, he explained, they needed intensive training. And for that, Thomas decided to set up a kind of training camp in an area where no one was looking for them, in the South. At that point, the story of the BLA, for the police at least, took a surprising turn in San Francisco. On the evening of Saturday, August 28th, a police sergeant named George Kowalski, it's a guy literally named Kowalski, Sergeant Kowalski was cruising through the rough streets of the Mission District alone when two black men in a dark Oldsmobile stopped in front of him. One opened fire with a submachine gun. Kowalski ducked, found himself unharmed, then gave chase, leading to a wild pursuit through city streets that ended when the driver of the Oldsmobile lost control of the car, sliding into a curb and was surrounded by police. Both men emerged with hands held high. I mean, just like Kowalski is such like a movie name, like it's like the literal like the penguin meme from Madagascar, like Kowalski. It's a meme name. The two, Anthony Bottom and Albert Washington, turned out to be Black Panthers, and after detectives began questioning 19-year-old Bottom, he gave them quite a story. According to Bottom, he was part of a group of Panthers who had staged a series of minor Bay Area bombings stretching back at least a year. They would later be charged with the murder of a San Francisco policeman as well. But what stunned his questioners was when Bottom volunteered that he and Washington had been among 5 San Francisco Panthers who had journeyed east that May and murdered 2 New York policemen, Waverly Jones and Joseph Piacentini. Bottom's information eventually led to the arrests of the others, including a live Panther named Herman Bell, who had fled with several others for New Orleans, where, police learned, they had begun robbing banks. The Bell-Bottom Panthers weren't officially members of the BLA, but they might as well have been. Jaruba Moore had been more than willing to take responsibility for their killings in New York. In Washington, FBI officials watched all these events with mounting alarm. The BLA was fulfilling every warning about black militancy J. Edgar Hoover had made. During the past several months, the Cleaver faction of the Black Panther Party has moved on a course of increased violence, lawlessness, and terror, Hoover wrote every FBI office on September 24th. I consider their potential for violence and disruption greater today than ever before. This bureau must approach its investigation of extremist activity with renewed vigor and imagination. For once, Hoover was right, not that it made a bit of difference. Remember, this Burroughs doesn't like Herbert Hoover because he is a lib, and Hoover is more right-leaning than not. And he isn't very well liked by libs because of his legacy at the FBI and among other reasons. But yeah, this is very interesting that he thinks that Hoover's actually correct here. The framing is interesting to me. Moving on. At just about the moment Anthony Bottom and Albert Washington were arrested in San Francisco, members of John Thomas's BLA cell began arriving in Atlanta. There were 17 of them in all, by far the largest single BLA group ever assembled. The number 2 man, Andrew Jackson, a veteran of 757 Beck Street, was there, as was Joanne Chesimard and Twyman Myers. Some came in a rented rider van piled high with guns and books, others by car, the last few by Greyhound bus. And there's a footnote here. The story of the BLA's sojourn in Atlanta is based on interviews 2 captured BLA members gave to the NYPD months later, along with newspaper accounts of their crimes and interviews with policemen who investigated them. And we'll move on to the text again. Several checked into the Bellevue Hotel on Auburn Avenue. Within days, they found their new headquarters, a large frame home they rented on Fayetteville Road in the semi-rural area of DeKalb County, on the city's eastern reaches. This would be the BLA's first training camp. Atlanta was supposed to be a school, a training ground. We were sending everyone there, recalls Blood McCreary. Once you got through Atlanta, you were supposed to be ready for anything. Once they moved in, Thomas began showing everyone how to clean, strip, and fire pistols and rifles. Classes were held in map making, use of a compass, and robbery techniques. Chesimard led sessions in first aid. Every few days, they drove the van into a wooded area where Thomas had everyone shoot on jerry-rigged firing ranges. Other times, they tried to learn wilderness skills, something none of them, city dwellers as they were, knew much about. After 3 weeks, the money began to run low. Thomas sent everyone into Atlanta to fan out and identify a bank to rob. When the group reassembled that evening, he gave a long talk to the group on how to stage an efficient robbery. Everyone was told to take notes, and afterward Thomas reviewed all the members' notebooks to make sure his message had sunk in. He then scouted the location himself and announced they had found their target, a branch of the Fulton National Bank on Peters Street. To rehearse, they built a sandbox in which they constructed a model of the bank and its surroundings. Thomas moved around the sandbox, drawing arrows with a stick and discussing each member's role. In preparation, Myers and a young recruit named Fred Hilton were sent into downtown Atlanta to steal a car, only to return, crestfallen, without one. Unable to hotwire a car themselves, they ended up robbing a garage attendant who refused to hand over a vehicle. Irked, Thomas sent Myers and another teenager, Samuel Cooper, to try again. This time they walked into a downtown garage, pointed a pistol at the attendant, and were just about to steal a car when a woman drove up. Myers shoved the attendant out of sight while Cooper politely accepted the unknowing woman's keys and handed her a ticket. They then drove off in her car. I mean, just the gall with these people. They robbed the bank on October 7th, covering the customers and quickly leaping the cages. Afterwards, flush with cash, Thomas decided to establish a second safe house outside Atlanta. Joanne Chesimard led a scouting team of 5 members to Greenville, South Carolina, but after a week of searching for a suitable retreat, they received word from Thomas to begin looking in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Chesimard's group arrived there on October 14th, checking into 3 rooms at the Rosetta Motel on 37th Street. They later moved into a set of apartments. In the following days, Thomas sent several members shuttling back and forth between the 2 cities, redistributing the guns, ammunition, and belongings. He then announced that it was time to begin their long-planned war. To all of them, that meant one thing: killing policemen. Thomas selected the 2 youngest members, Twyman Myers and Freddie Hilton, for the honor of the first kill. The 2 teens had bore the brunt of his anger more than once, for mishandling stolen cars and for crashing the Ryder van into a tree and having to abandon it. Now, Thomas announced, they must prove they were worthy of the BLA. They would go into the streets of Atlanta, alone, and kill. A few minutes after midnight on the morning of November 3rd, 1971, a 27-year-old Atlanta police officer named James Green walked out of Grandma's Biscuits with a late-night snack, a cup of coffee, and a ham biscuit. He climbed into his patrol wagon and drove to a darkened service station on Memorial Drive across from a cemetery. He had just finished the sandwich when Twyman Myers and Freddie Hilton materialized from the shadows on both sides of the wagon, raised their .38 caliber pistols, and opened fire with no warning. Green never had a chance. Struck by 3 bullets, he would be dead by morning. It's very interesting to note the difference in individual people in how in hit placement of how quickly people tend to die and how many bullets it takes to kill somebody. Remember the previous incident with Pia Genetti, etc., in New York that we talked about in Chapter 8. That guy took 22 shots, and this guy takes 3, and from .38 caliber pistols, which I'm assuming are probably .38 specials. So, which is not a particularly powerful round. In fact, it's somewhat anemic and underpowered compared to 9mm, which today is a far more common caliber. But of course, .38 caliber pistols are deadly. They are effective, and a lot of people get killed by .38 caliber. Myers and Hilton opened the car door, tore off Green's badge with such force that they ripped his shirt and took his pistol. When they returned to the house on Fayetteville Road, one BLA member would recall, months later, they were triumphant, brandishing the police revolver and the badge, announcing, "We did it! We did it!" John Thomas was pleased. He dispatched the two to the Chattanooga apartments to hide out. At the same time, he summoned two other members, Cooper and Ronald Anderson, to return from Tennessee. When they arrived, Thomas led them into a bedroom where Jackson was waiting. "You know what happened?" Thomas asked. They knew. "Your two brothers did it," he continued. Motioning toward Jackson, he said, "You'll all have the next one." The next morning, Cooper woke to find Jackson caressing Officer Green's stolen revolver. "The pigs got nice guns," he remarked. On November 7th, 4 days after the murder of Officer Green, Andrew Jackson led his two young charges into Atlanta to kill a second policeman. Instead, after a passing patrolman noticed their guns, they ended up getting arrested outside of a convenience store. Womp womp. When the news reached John Thomas, he ordered an immediate evacuation. The group piled everything into two cars and drove to the apartments in Chattanooga, where they pored over the newspapers for any sign of what was happening back in Atlanta. After 4 days, it became clear that Jackson and the others would not be released anytime soon. Thomas announced that everyone was returning to New York. On the morning of November 11th, the remaining 9 members of the cell drove east out of Chattanooga in 2 cars, crossing the Smoky Mountains into North Carolina. Everything went smoothly until one of the cars was stopped by a sheriff's deputy named Ted Elmore in Catawba County, North Carolina. A gunfight broke out. Elmore was shot and left paralyzed. 4 of the group's members were arrested. The others rendezvoused in Norfolk, Virginia, and decided they couldn't afford to return to New York, where too many people knew them. Instead, Thomas led 4 of them to Florida, where they were later accused of robbing a bank in Miami and robbing a gun store in Tampa. On December 30th, they checked into a hotel in the small town of Odessa, north of Tampa, when a hotel employee became suspicious. Police were called. FBI agents arrived on the scene the next day. Thomas and his girlfriend went quietly. Another BLM member, Frank Fields, probably one of the 3 men who attacked officers Curry and Benetti, ran, and an FBI agent opened fire. A bullet struck Fields in the eye, killing him. The implosion of John Thomas's cell scattered nearly 20 BLA militants all across the Southeast. As the new year, 1972, dawned, Thomas sat in a Tampa jail awaiting bank robbery charges. 4 others were behind bars in North Carolina. Andrew Jackson and 2 others, arrested in Atlanta, had managed to escape from a county jail and made their way into Florida as well, where they spent 2 months picking tomatoes alongside migrant workers in an effort to raise money for the bus fare back north. The others trickled back to New York in 1s and 2s. Marooned outside Tampa, Twyman Myers and the teenaged Mark Holder stuffed dozens of guns into 3 suitcases, stole a car, and drove back. Holder was arrested with most of the guns in Philadelphia 3 weeks later. The sudden loss of a dozen men did little to dissuade the BLA members still in New York. If anything, it motivated them to strike back, to show authorities that they remained viable and strong. At the time, there were still at least 2 active New York subcells, both devoted to armed robbery, mostly of drug dealers and social clubs. Even before the loss of Thomas and so many of his men, one of these cells had also talked about heading south. In December, this group, led by a 28-year-old ex-Marine named Ronald Carter, embarked on a multi-state odyssey whose bloody climax would shake the city of New York to its core and trigger a national debate about the BLA that would, in a small way, reverberate in the 1972 presidential primaries. The full story of the Carter cell has never been told. Only 3 members remain alive, and one, Blood McCreary, tells his version of events here for the first time. Because of the crimes involved, however, his account is incomplete, and, in at least one regard, open to doubt. McCreary, for example, states that the Carter group chose to leave New York after the Shakur brothers, Lumumba and Zaid, decided to make a cell for Assata, That is, for Joanne Chesimard, the Thomas cell's most prominent survivor. As McCreary tells the story, the group had hoped to receive guidance of some sort from Algeria. A meeting was arranged with Cleaver's emissary, the fiery poet Denise Oliver. That cell came about from Algeria, or it was supposed to, McCreary recalls. Denise had been over there, and she came back with instructions from Eldridge. You know, Algeria. They had some good ideas, but they didn't really run us. Anyway, Denise was to meet with us and give us the information from Algeria. Several of us, we all showed up to meet Denise. That meeting didn't go down because Asata wanted to get back to Atlanta because shit was going down there. But she didn't go. Things were too fucked up. So when she stayed, it was decided to create a new cell for Asata. This new cell, led by Carter and Chesimard, soon fled New York for Miami, which McCready says was the plan all along. A more likely explanation for their sudden departure involves a bizarre episode in Queens on December 20th, 1971. At 9:30 that morning, two patrolmen in a squad car spied four people in a green Pontiac, one woman and three men, parked in front of a Bankers Trust branch on Grand Avenue at 49th Street, acting suspiciously. When the cruiser approached, the Pontiac pulled away from the curb. Following at a safe distance, the officers checked its license plate and discovered that the car had been stolen. When the cruiser lit its rolling lights, the Pontiac took off, racing to the corner of Flushing Avenue and 57th Street, where it turned southwest toward Brooklyn. As the chase continued, someone in the Pontiac rolled down a window and lobbed something toward the cruiser. It was, of all things, a hand grenade, an M26 fragmentation grenade, to be exact, the kind used by the U.S. Army in Vietnam. To the officer's amazement, it exploded beside the cruiser, wrecking it. As the officers leaped, unhurt, from the burning car, the Pontiac roared off toward Brooklyn, where a few minutes later its occupants jumped out, rushed toward a man at a Sunoco gas station, and stole his car. Later, the man identified Joanne Chesimard as one of his assailants. The NYPD immediately issued a 13-state alarm calling for her arrest. And there's another footnote here. Chesimard's ID, while likely, is not ironclad. The witness, Paul Costa, also identified another BLA member, Andrew Jackson, who was in Florida at this time. Right, so you can kind of see the way that this is working already. The attempt to set up cells in Nashville and in Georgia, in Atlanta, and as well as in Florida. These are all areas with substantial black populations. Just mostly it's just the South. And the problem with it is, first of all, you still have a lot more, you'd imagine a lot better presence or less, what am I trying to say here? A less ability for political pressure from law enforcement compared to in New York and San Francisco and all these other places. At least less pressure on law enforcement from the local politicos to knock this stuff off. And the other thing is they really haven't done any of the ground level organization before engaging in several of these actions. So it shows you that you got to set up the ground level organization. You have to get local contacts. You can't just be a total outsider in the community. Any sort of guerrilla movement or infiltrating movement that wants some sort of change needs to be able, once you get access to a place or you move to a new area, you really have to set up shop before you begin making trouble. Like that's what the lesson of this is, basically, from the perspective of a terror cell. As police suspected, the attack was almost certainly the work of Chesimard and the Carter cell. In the BLA's first ever phone call to the press, a caller to the United Press International took credit in the name of the Attica Brigade of the Afro-American Liberation Army, Cleaver's name for the BLA, saying, "We have more grenades and we will be back." Yeah, where did they get these grenades from, man? Like, where? Like, obviously they probably stole them, but you'd have to have somebody who has access to a U.S. Army armory, basically, to get it. And you would think that grenades are kind of a sensitive item, at least in peacetime, domestically. The police dragnet would explain why Chesimard, Carter, McCreary, and 3 other comrades swiftly relocated to the Miami area. There, they rented an apartment in the beachfront city of Hollywood and began scouting banks. They probably didn't know that at that very moment they had become the 3rd BLA group at large in the state of Florida. Simon JJ says it's like modern day Sweden. I mean, yeah. Yes, exactly. These same things just keep playing out over and over and over again. Like, how the heck are they getting all of these arms? They pulled off a quick bank robbery in Miami, running out in less than 5 minutes. Much as John Thomas had done after his robberies in New York, the cell took its cash and began making plans. Carter and Chesimard, in fact, envisioned sharply expanding the BLA's reach, creating a string of safe houses across the Midwest. Within days, they had left Miami, scattering to rent apartments in Cleveland, Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Kansas City. Carter and McCreary then returned to New York, where they met with Zaid Shakur, who was still in touch with Algeria. They agreed that their immediate focus should be freeing those who had been captured, especially Dhoruba Moore and, at Chesimard's urging, her boyfriend, who had been arrested in Detroit. "We were going to break them out," McCreary recalls. "I went with Asata to Detroit and looked things over, but it was clear it would never work. It was obvious we could never get near them." Right, so you can kind of see a bit of the pattern here as well. All of these areas in the Midwest that they're talking about, Cleveland, Milwaukee, less so Kansas, St. Louis, and Kansas City, these are all areas that have kind of been picked over by the Weathermen a year or two, if not more so, before. Right, these are all areas that have heavily industrialized, working class populations, union presences, typical Marxist professors at these universities. But the problem here is that these areas are kind of already picked over for these guys. And again, Weather Underground, after the Days of Rage, chose specifically to basically abandon these areas and focused only on the coasts. Right, only on the coasts, basically, only New York and San Francisco, and maybe Chicago, with a residual presence there. So it's very interesting that the black radicals are choosing, after the white radicals have already left these areas, to reoccupy this space. So that's very interesting. Afterwards, members of the cell rendezvoused at their new Cleveland safe house, a set of 3 apartments on East 84th Street. Once it became clear that there was no easy way to free the prisoners, the new plans were sketched out. Both involved actions in New York. "Cleveland was our new home," McCreary remembers, "but New York City was to be our battleground." All through the first days of 1972, BLA members shuttled back and forth between Cleveland and New York. After the Thomas Group's shootout in North Carolina, they eschewed cars and began traveling by Greyhound bus. The drawback was the Pennsylvania State Police's penchant for boarding buses to search for drugs. "Every time they came aboard, we were strapped with guns," McCreary recalls the Shiver. "Those are some pretty hot moments." Right, of course, once again, the necessity of left-wing political terror groups to rely on public transportation for logistics. And I think we can get a sense of why exactly these guys are choosing Cleveland, because they're shuffling back and forth. Cleveland is a relatively safe area that you can set up in. You're not doing direct attacks in Cleveland, but what you are doing is you're trying to capture space in New York, right? Cleveland seems to be relatively safer for them. At least that's what this paragraph seems to imply to me. And you're moving to New York to begin your violent actions and conquer New York as a territory, basically. In short order, the Cleveland cell grew in size to 9 as McCreary tracked down 3 soldiers who had lost their way, including Twyman Myers, whom he stumbled across one night in the East Village, and a new recruit, Henry Shasha Brown. In Cleveland, they quickly went to work on an audacious plan that originated with Cleaver and Don Cox in Algeria. Black guerrillas had launched a civil war in the South African country of Zimbabwe, and the white-led government had responded with a string of indiscriminate killings. Cleveland suggested that the Cleveland cell attempt to storm the Zimbabwean consulate in New York. We wanted to make a signature statement in New York, something that would get us noticed internationally, says McCreary. So we scouted out the consulate. It was off Park Avenue in the 50s. We went in. We could see it was going to be too much trouble. Too much traffic, it just didn't work out. So we found the diplomats all lived in homes on Long Island, like in a compound. The place was guarded by these huge dogs, Rhodesian Ridgebacks. So we go out there to poison these dogs, and needless to say, it didn't work. And so we went to an alternate plan, and I don't want to talk about that. And with good reason. The Carter cell's alternate plan almost certainly led to one of the most gruesome murders in the history of New York. The night of February 27th, 1972, was freezing. Frigid winter winds whistled down the garbage-strewn streets of New York's East Village. Snow was on the way. Down on Avenue B, 2 young patrolmen were walking their beat. Greg Foster, who was 22, was black. Rocco Lowry, a year older, was white. The two had served together as Marines in Vietnam, and as close friends, had received permission to be partners, patrolling one of New York's most dangerous and drug-ridden neighborhoods. I mean, this is like the buddy cop narrative, like, the 80s stereotype of like the white dude with his black partner. I mean, it's just like, oh shoot, what is that movie? This is like the plot of Die Hard, right? It's like, or not Die Hard. Sorry. What's the movie with Mel Gibson and what's his face? Donald Glover. I can't remember that movie's name anymore. But it's basically the same plot line, right? Similar vibe. The two were walking south along Avenue B around 10:30. Oh, thank you, Yiz. Lethal Weapon, thank you. Yeah, it's like Lethal Weapon. So they were walking south along Avenue B around 10:30 when they noticed a car parked in front of a hydrant. They ducked into a luncheonette across the street, the Shrimp Boat, and asked the owner if he knew the car. He stepped outside and shook his head no. Satisfied, Foster and Lowry turned and began to walk back north. As they did, 3 black men passed, parting to allow the officers to walk between them. One of the men wore a long black coat, another a green fatigue jacket, and a black Australian-style bush hat. A moment after the officers passed, the 3 men suddenly turned and drew pistols, a .38 automatic and 2 9mm automatics. Foster and Lowry were a few strides away when the men began firing directly into their backs. Foster was hit 8 times and fell in a heap onto the icy pavement. 6 bullets hit Lowry. All but 1 struck his arms and legs, but the last pierced his neck, and he staggered forward, clutching at his throat before dropping to his knees and falling slowly onto his side. As the two men lay dying, their assassins marched calmly toward them. A witness later claimed one of the shooters hollered, "Shoot him in the balls," and all three again opened fire. 3 bullets were fired directly into Foster's eyes. 2 were shot into Lowry's groin. While both men lay still, 2 of the assassins reached down and wrenched loose their pistols. They ran toward a waiting Chrysler, while the third man, apparently intoxicated by the moment, reportedly danced a jig over the dead man's bodies, firing his pistol into the air Wild West style. Startled to be left behind, he ran off alone, disappearing into the night. The whine of police sirens echoed within minutes, and the first several officers to respond, all answering a disturbance call 2 blocks away, were quickly on the scene. What they found was stomach-turning. Greg Foster's head had been destroyed. A sludge of blood and brain matter formed a 3-foot puddle around his corpse. Rocco Lowry had been shot to pieces, bullet wounds up and down his body. An ambulance took Lowry to Bellevue Hospital, where he died. Almost everyone who had responded had the same thought. These were planned assassinations, no doubt by the same people who had murdered officers Piagentini and Jones 8 months before. This so-called Black Liberation Army. It only took a few hours to confirm it. Fingerprints found in the getaway car suggested that the assassins were Ronald Carter, Twyman Myers, and at least one other member of the Cleveland cell. He says these were all Africans, yes, and insane savages. Simon says pure evil. Yes, as far as I know, these are all 3 of them members of the BLA. These are all African. These are all blacks. And again, this is such a weird thing, right? Because the interracial solidarity and professionalism of the police force here is being put up against the black radicals. Yeah, he says civilization is not communicable, and this is some savage stuff, man. I mean, yeah, it is. It's completely savage stuff. And you basically have an integrated police force already. But the problem is that the radicals aren't happy, and this is the failure again, just giving a very, very picturesque vision of the failure of Popper's paradox of tolerance. But as we know, Popper's paradox of tolerance doesn't actually work if it fails because it consistently in the post-war World War II era fails to its left and never to its right. This is a structural thing. The Foster-Lowry murders presented Mayor John Lindsay's administration with much the same dilemma it had confronted after the first attacks the previous May. Within hours, in fact, a series of debates erupted within the police department and the mayor's office. Were these planned assassinations or something else? If they were the work of the same group behind the attacks in May, as was widely assumed, did this mean there actually was a genuine Black Liberation Army? Was there really a nationwide black conspiracy to murder policemen? And if so, should the public be told? What police knew was this. 10 officers had now been attacked and 7 killed in a 9-month span in New York, San Francisco, North Carolina, and Atlanta, seemingly all by one-time Panthers claiming to be a Black Liberation Army. Some of these attacks were linked, some were not. Many in the NYPD believed that this constituted a legitimate national conspiracy. But others, including several aides in Mayor Lindsay's office, felt that the killings were unrelated. Yeah, of course, the mayor's office, who's trying to get reelected, doesn't think that they're related. There was no Black Army, they argued. This was the work of a few disgruntled Panthers borrowing a discarded Panther term to make it appear as if there was. Oh, it's all just emergent behavior. Emergent behavior. Yeah, exactly. We can't let the people know our melting pot liberal project is a dirty lie. And yes, they still try to keep that a secret to this day. It's all just emergent behavior, guy. It's all just, it's not a conspiracy. It's not a plan. Yeah, where have we heard that before? Of course. The pivotal figure in these debates was a newcomer to the NYPD, a deputy police commissioner named Robert Daly. Daly had been a New York Times reporter who had attracted the attention of Police Commissioner Patrick Murphy while writing a profile of him. When Murphy offered him the department's top public relations job, Daly accepted. He was a divisive figure, a publicity hound who, as the Times itself noted later, was always mugging for the cameras. What Daly loved most was a good detective yarn, and the story of the BLA was one of the best he had seen. Gunsmoke had barely cleared over Foster and Lowry's bodies when he began arguing that the NYPD had an obligation to go public with its suspicions that the murders constituted a planned assassination by a national conspiracy of black nationalists. I mean, actually, Daly's not wrong. I don't think Daly's wrong. This kind of talk startled aides to Mayor Lindsay, who had announced his campaign for the presidency a month earlier. Talk of black terrorists loosed in the streets would undercut his candidacy, inflame race relations, and have every cop in the city looking askance at young black men. Lindsay's combative press secretary, Tom Morgan, made clear to everyone that he didn't want to see a single word about black conspiracies in the press. Swarmed by reporters the morning after the murders, the chief of detectives, Albert Seidman, Sneed went along, poo-pooing the conspiracy angle. But the next day, a Saturday, the UPI office received a handwritten communique signed by the George Jackson Squad of the Black Liberation Army. Mailed the previous day, it referenced the pigs wiped out in Lower Manhattan last night and promised, "This is the start of our spring offensive. There is more to come." This was too much for Daly. That same afternoon, even as citizens in far-off Arizona were voting in the caucuses, in which Lindsay placed second to Edmund Muskie, Daly strode into an East Village precinct house and, standing before a bank of microphones, raised Raquel Lowry's blood-drenched shirt for all to see. He called the murders assassinations carried out by a conspiracy of urban guerrillas. Black urban guerrillas. Urban guerrillas. I mean, yes. Always in the past, the police have been quiet about this conspiracy because of fear of accusations of racism, he said. But it isn't the black community that is doing this. It is a few dozen black criminal thugs. It's terribly serious, much more serious than people seem to think. The police are the last barrier before chaos. Oh, and just to remind everyone, there's a footnote here. Jackson was a California prison inmate and best-selling author who had been killed the previous August. He gets talked about more in chapter 12, so we will get to him. And he comes up later as well because George Jackson's saga inspires people like Ray Levasseur as well. So we will get to that later. And of course, is Ray Daly wrong here? Or excuse me, is Daly wrong here? Bob Daly? No. He's actually sounds quite moderate in my view. This is very much a law and order talking point and line here that he's using. It's not the blacks as a whole. It's just a few bad apples. But of course, that line is unacceptable. Even that line is unacceptable. Why? Because obviously Mayor Lindsay is trying to primary and needs the black vote, obviously. Suddenly, the rhetorical cat was out of the bag. The mayor's people were apoplectic. But the New York newspapers, sensing a story too hot to handle, downplayed Daley's dramatic press conference. The Times buried the story on page 35. Yes, yes, they buried the lead. The New York Times buried the lead once again. Won't someone think of the poor political campaign? That's what really matters. Yes, of course he is. Talk of a black conspiracy ebbed for several days as reporters focused on the officers' funerals, which were massive affairs, with hundreds of uniformed officers lining Fifth Avenue in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral. But Daley would not let up. I mean, but look at the press's tactic here, right? What does this tactic remind us all of? This reminds us of similar tactics to Keir Starmer, right? And the previous Ariana Grande concerts in Britain. Oh, don't look back in anger. Don't look back in anger, right? Right. That's what this sounds like. Oh, you can't, like, oh, it's such a tragedy. Everybody focus on the tragedy of the moment and not on the culprits, not on the several bad apples. And why the bad apples are saying that they're performing these actions. But Daley could not let up. In off-the-record chats all that week, he told reporters that there was a true national conspiracy, that the NYPD's intelligence, gathered over the previous 7 months, confirmed the existence of a Black Liberation Army, with hundreds of would-be assassins divided into revolutionary cells. For the most part, no one believed him. No one, at least, printed more of his theories. It was all too inflammatory, too far-fetched. Yeah, it's just a crazy conspiracy theory, bro. You're just crazy. You're just a crazy conspiracy theorist who's just noticing patterns that aren't there. Yeah. Finally, a week after the murders, a Times reporter cornered a reluctant Commissioner Murphy. All available evidence, Murphy admitted, suggested that the Foster-Lowry murders were in fact the work not of a national conspiracy to kill police, but of roving bands of militants. Crazies, Murphy termed them, who moved from city to city, murdering policemen. Daley, however, went much further. He told the Times that there was a BLA that was nationwide in scope, adding, "We have here a very, very dangerous and criminal conspiracy. The public really doesn't seem to be aware of it. The time is over when the police department should keep its mouth shut on this kind of thing." Working with incomplete information, neither man was entirely correct. This is Burroughs writing here. The BLA was far too disorganized and far too decentralized to be called a true national conspiracy. But it was more than roving bands of crazies. Daley would not be deterred. Over the vocal opposition of the Manhattan District Attorney, Frank Hogan, he persuaded Commissioner Murphy to hold an unusual press conference on Tuesday, February 8th, in which Murphy detailed the BLA's involvement not only in the Foster-Lowry murders, but also in the May attacks and the attacks on policemen in San Francisco and Atlanta. He named 9 BLA figures sought by police, including Ronald Carter, Joanne Chesimard, and Twyman Myers. Prosecutors had adamantly opposed going public, arguing that it would complicate any case they brought. The mayor's office objected as well, finally persuading Murphy not to use the word conspiracy. But the debate and the killings were far from over. Yeah, it's not happening. It's not happening. It's not happening. But this is also the problem as well. And Simon JJ says, same script, it works, and the press never changes. And yeah, he agrees with saying the way the media works is disgusting. Yes, I mean, but this is exactly the problem, is that these tactics actually do work. And this is the thing, right? We have a much more post-war on terror you have a much more refined idea of how terrorist cells function. And just because it is decentralized without a national leadership does not mean that it does not have leadership, does not mean that it does not have people who are in prominence and doing the heavy lifting, does not mean that it does not exist at all. Right? This is the inherent problem, and this is the point that I was trying to harp on in the last chapter. Whereas Weather Underground was much more centralized with a much more controlling leadership, and this is much more decentralized. It's still similar. They're still performing similar actions. They're not doing bombings. They're using firearms as the mechanism of terror. But it's basically the same thing, right? You're doing the same thing. You're trying to go from New York and trying to conquer space in Atlanta and Nashville and all these other places in the Midwest and Cleveland, and you're trying to expand your network. So Murphy is absolutely correct. The problem is that Murphy, in his sensationalism and in his lack, and in just the lack of the time of understanding networks, right? Instead of saying, this is the power of language, right? You don't say that it's a conspiracy. You can say, no, this is a network. This is a network of people who are doing these things, right? And so you can establish that they're all connected in some way, that they have similar belief systems, but it's not, the word conspiracy doesn't exactly work. Whereas the word network, in my opinion, probably does. And this is the lack of understanding on Murphy's part about, just because it's not a wheel or a hub form of organization, just because it's a more decentralized web format, doesn't mean that it's not a thing, right? And of course, the liberal types like the mayor's office are going to say, obviously, oh, well, you're noticing a pattern. And because they're liberals, they don't like to notice patterns. They can't notice patterns. So they're incentivized in any case to admit that to refuse to admit that this thing is actually something. Moving on. Hello, Cody Bassett. Yeah, you're about halfway through this chapter, my friend. Actually, more like 3/4, to be honest. We're almost done here. So moving on. The murders of Greg Foster and Rocco Lowry have never officially been solved, but there is little doubt that the killers came from the Ronald Carter Joanne Chesimard cell based in Cleveland. While political debates raged in Manhattan, Carter and his 8 comrades pored over New York newspapers, following the investigation. After 2 weeks, they began to fear they had stayed too long in one place. So we took a vote, Blood McCreary remembers. We decided to go to St. Louis. A safe house there was already in place. On Monday, February 14th, they rented a U-Haul truck, which the group crammed with furniture, books, mattresses, and personal belongings. The next morning, they left the city in a 3-vehicle caravan heading towards St. Louis. On long trips I drove, says McCreary, whose family was originally from South Carolina. I had the Southern manners, you know. Yes, sir, whatever you say, sir, which was needed at toll booths or if we got stopped. Our younger guys, Twyman and them, they didn't have the manners. If a cop car stopped us, they always wanted to shoot. Yeah, see, this is the problem, is that the hotheads need to be controlled in new areas. You need to set up shop first before you can actually start doing stuff, like I mentioned before. They reached the St. Louis safe house without incident. It was late afternoon, says McCreary. Later, we decided to go looking for out-of-state newspapers. 4 of us went. Me, Twyman, Ronald Carter, and Shasha Brown. We drove downtown looking for a newsstand. That was a mistake. Seemed like everything was closed. Then I saw the cop's car. It was 9:30 p.m. when the 2 St. Louis policemen, cruising North Grand Avenue in a black neighborhood, spotted a green 1967 Oldsmobile, sporting, of all things, a set of cardboard Michigan license plates. The cruiser lit its rolling lights. McCreary was behind the wheel. I said, "We got lights," he remembers. And Ronnie leaned forward. He was in the back seat and said, "Be cool. Just pull over." One officer hung back while the second walked to the driver's side window. We had all been taught that, if you get stopped, the first thing you do is roll down all the car windows, McCreary says. That way, if you have to shoot, you don't want glass exploding all over you. So we rolled down our windows. I took out my wallet. When he came to the car, I had everything in my hand. Everything he needed was in my hand. But it wasn't right. The car had Michigan temporary plates. It was registered in Florida. My driver's license was my alias, Frank Reese of Windsor, North Carolina. Poor cop, he was as confused as anything. He says, "I'm going to have to ask you guys to step out of the car." And I was doing everything I could to get out of this. I kept saying, why was that necessary? Why? We all had on shoulder holsters, McCreary says. Twyman was beside me in front. I saw he had the 9mm between his legs. In the trunk, we had like 17 different guns, an M16, a bunch of Browning 9mm. I had a 357. Shasha had a 9mm. I had been through several situations with Tymon, and I knew that when he was about to shoot, he always started rocking back and forth. And I realized he had started rocking in his seat. I'm talking to the cop, and I feel Twyman pulling at my sleeve. He wants me to lean back so he can shoot the cop. I know he's about to shoot, and I'm trying everything I can do to make this cop go away. The cops keep saying, "Get out of the car." I keep saying, "Officer, why is that necessary? All our papers are in order. Why is that necessary?" And finally, he had enough. He said, "Nigger, get out of the fucking car." And when he said that, I just leaned back, and all I saw then was red and blue streaks of fire going past my face. Twyman was shooting, and then, the whole car kind of exploded. The officer beside the car fell, struck in the stomach and legs. As the Olds roared off, he fired all 6 shots in his revolver. As luck would have it, 2 narcotics officers were on a stakeout a block away and heard the shooting. They gave chase. I mean, what? They're doing a narcotics stakeout in the black neighborhood. I'm just saying that, guys. Spying their pursuit, McCreary mashed the accelerator, hitting speeds close to 100 miles per hour as the Olds zigzagged through narrow streets toward the Mississippi River waterfront. By the time he got there were 4 police cars behind him, their sirens echoing through the downtown streets. When one approached his fender, he swung the steering wheel violently to the left. The Olds veered into a vicious left turn, turning completely around until it hopped a curb, all 4 tires blown, and came to rest against a high chain-link fence bordering a vacant lot. When the car stopped, McCreary turned to face Ronnie Carter, only to find him slumped forward, a sick gurgling noise coming from his throat. An autopsy would reveal that he had accidentally been killed by a BLA bullet fired by Shasha Brown. I mean, yet another example of black-on-black violence. I mean, wow. McCreary leaped outside. A hail of bullets drove him toward the chain-link fence. We were trying to get to the trunk, he recalls. If we could have gotten the M16 or the 30-06, we would have gotten away. Up and down the wide boulevard, policemen were crouching behind their cruisers firing. The 3 BLA men ran to the fence. McCreary turned and provided covering fire as Myers and Shasha Brown climbed it and vaulted into the vacant lot. When he ran out of ammunition, McCreary threw down his pistol and surrendered. The police captured Brown a few blocks away, bleeding from a wound in his wrist. Only Twyman Myers managed to get away, disappearing into the night. In the first confused hours after the incident, there was nothing to link it to the BLA. Both McCreary and Brown gave false names. What triggered a barrage of early morning phone calls to New York was the discovery that a pistol Brown had thrown down had, until 2 weeks before, belonged to Officer Rocco Lowry. This changed everything. For the first time, the NYPD felt obliged to reveal everything they knew. I mean, New York got mugged by reality, apparently. At a press conference 2 days later, Commissioner Murphy called on the White House, the Attorney General, and the FBI to give the highest priority to the hunt for the Foster Lowry assassins and the BLA. After Murphy spoke, the NYPD's Assistant Chief Inspector, Arthur Grubert, detailed the attacks on police in New York, San Francisco, and Atlanta, and gave reporters the most reasoned, lucid interview of the BLA to date. He noted, "Intelligence fails to identify a formal structure of firm organization known as the Black Liberation Army. It is more likely that various extremist individuals, 75 to 100 in number, are making use of the name Black Liberation Army in order to give some semblance of legitimacy to these homicidal acts. These individuals form and dissolve and reform in small groups or cells." The New York Police Department might not want to call the BLA a true army, but what it described sounded martial enough. The Times' skepticism, for instance, began to fall away. The headline of its front-page story of 17th February was "Evidence of Liberation Army Said to Rise." It was then, with its notoriety nearly at its zenith, that the BLA went utterly silent. Not a single word would be heard again for months. And that is the end of chapter 9. Emery, God. Why would you say that? Oh man, what a chapter! I mean, and that's why I wanted to do chapters 8 and 9 together, because they're the same story arc essentially. You have the lead up of chapter 8 going into chapter 9. And so these are, and because chapter 9 is so short, I wanted to do them together. So I'm glad I could knock these out. If you enjoyed this chapter, we'll see when the next one is. The next one is actually reverting back to the Weather Underground, but there's a lot of observations to be made there. A lot of notes that I've made in this chapter, especially the first part. And it's a short chapter too. It's about 20 pages, it looks like, maybe less. It's actually more like 15 or 16, but we'll have to do that a different day. Yes, by this point, I should make a quick organizational note here of the... I mean, it got a laugh, but more of a disgusting laugh. I mean, that's just nasty, dude. Why would you say that? Yeah, absolutely is. Right, I'm just going to do a quick organizational note before logging off here. The story now is going to revert back to the different groups, because a lot of this stuff is happening basically simultaneously or near simultaneously. You're still in early 1971 to 72 by this point. Early 1971 or late 1971 to 72. And you basically, the way that he writes this is that he flits back from Weather Underground to BLA to Weather Underground to BLA, and then finally he goes back to then finally he goes back to things like the Symbionese Liberation Army, and other groups of violence, right? So the story arc for Weather Underground and the Symbiony and the BLA is pretty much wrapping up by this point. So now that they've done all of this violent action, they've drawn the attention of the authorities. These groups are going to be targeted, and you'll find that they've already suffered internal conflicts amongst themselves, for ideological and personal reasons, and they're going to fall apart essentially under the pressure and lack of resources. So what happens now, and this is the lesson that I want to get ahead of in terms of the narrative, is how do you maintain the pace, right? Well, obviously you need to. The entire 1970s decade was incredibly violent and is remembered as such. And this proves that, okay, you have the first wave of violence, right? But now the second wave is about to happen, right? Which is a whole nother aspect of this, and it gets worse and worse and worse and worse as time goes on. It just gets crazier and crazier with all of this stuff. Yeah. So that's the take basically. And there are a lot of interesting figures that we haven't even discussed yet. We haven't even gotten to the Fallon yet, or Ray-Luc Levasseur. That's in the later part of the book. We've begun touching on people like Silvia Berardini, who will figure in that story arc much later. But these people are all roughly in the same circles. They're all in the same radical militant milieu, and I just wanted to talk about briefly that these groups are also segregated largely upon racial considerations. Like I mentioned before, the Weather Underground is largely perceived of in the time period as white, although a lot of them most of them are Jews. To be honest with it, they do have several white Gentiles. The Black Liberation Army is overwhelmingly black, with very few whites involved with that. So, and then the process of accumulation and consolidation of the intersectional coalition here, or the Rainbow Coalition as we might term it now, derogatorily, you start to see these groups and their personnel become increasingly diverse, right? So it's not just the blacks doing their own thing. It's not just the Weather Underground types. All of these different types of groups and these types of organizations have their strengths, but they also have very key weaknesses. And as we mentioned before, Weather Underground's weaknesses are it's a highly spoke or wheel or hub structure with very strong leadership and its nonviolent tendencies, and then the BLA is totally disorganized and just a network basically of similar-minded people all moving in the same direction, which makes it look simply emergent. But what you're going to find, and one of the big main points that I find of this book, is that with the accumulation of these groups, and of course the Fallon is different as well, but we'll get to them. But they have their own deal. All of these groups, once you start getting to the SLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army, and then the United Freedom Front, or the Sam Melville, Jonathan Jackson, or the Family, they become multicultural themselves, right? So these are groups where they have white Gentiles plus blacks plus white liberals and Jews, and of course, so these groups all seem to coalesce among themselves, right? And I just want to make that very clear that that's basically the process of intersectionalism and working together is rooted in this period, right? This is where it all comes from. This is the process of a coalescing of what we see today of the current powers that be on the left. So I just wanted to make a quick note of that before I log off today. Yiz the Eunuch asks, any idea when the next segment of this will be? We will see, Yiz. I'm not sure precisely. I tend to do these things when I have breaks in work and the things I'm doing right now. So we'll see. The next couple months are going to be very busy because I got a full slate, unfortunately. But we'll see about that. And I like to do this stuff off the cuff as well. I don't like to schedule these things out months in advance because then I feel obligated to do it. And if I can't make it or if I have to change it, then I feel bad. So I just like to do it whenever I can because it doesn't take that long. It takes a couple hours to sit through and read it and to give a take on it. So yeah, that's my approach for this because it makes a lot more sense. It's easier for me. So we'll see. I want to do. I probably should finish up the next couple of section here because this is basically we got through the first part with the Weather Underground, and we're basically going to finish part 2, and we're going to enter part 3, which is called the Second Wave, where we start getting into the SLA. And so there's only 2 more chapters before the next part, and we're going to I probably should finish these up in the next couple of weeks or so if I have time. So we'll plan for that, but we'll see how it goes. Emery Randall with the massive shit post. It got so cold last winter that I saw black dudes with their pants pulled up. Wow, that's pretty cold. That's pretty cold. Anyway, have a great week, everybody, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.